You paid $1,000 for that dump. The laughter rolled across the parking lot before Caleb Walker even stepped out of his truck. A few men shook their heads. One snapped a photo with his phone. Another pointed toward the collapsing garage and laughed harder. But 6 months later, some of those same people would drive hundreds of miles just to get through its front door. The old building sat on the edge of Riverton, Wyoming, surrounded by dry grass and rusting chain-link fencing. Its faded sign hung crooked above a pair of cracked garage doors. Several broken windows had been covered with plywood years earlier, and weeds pushed through the concrete as if nature itself had already claimed ownership. To most people, it looked like a place waiting to disappear. To Caleb Walker, it looked like an opportunity. The afternoon sun burned across the Wyoming sky as he stood beside his aging pickup truck and studied the property in silence. His worn denim jacket carried stains from years of mechanical work. His hands were rough. His boots were dusty. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the garage with unusual focus. Across the lot stood Madeline Carter, billionaire CEO of Carter Holdings. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I assume you know this property is scheduled for demolition next month. Caleb nodded. I heard. Then you also know nobody wants it. Maybe. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Maybe. Before Caleb could answer, another voice interrupted. Richard Hale stepped forward with an amused grin. There is no maybe about it. He looked directly at Caleb. This place is worthless. Several company representatives chuckled quietly. Richard gestured toward the building. The roof leaks. The wiring is outdated. Half the equipment is junk. He paused for effect. Actually, all the equipment is junk. More laughter followed. Caleb remained calm. He simply looked back at the garage. The wind moved softly through the weeds growing near the fence line. Somewhere inside the building, a loose piece of metal rattled against the wall. How much? Caleb asked. Madeline folded her arms. $1,000. Richard laughed immediately. Take it. Another executive smirked. Best deal he will ever get. Caleb looked at the structure one more time. The peeling paint. The cracked concrete. The neglected walls. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a cashier's check. I will take it. The laughter stopped. Not completely. Just enough for surprise to replace certainty. Madeline accepted the check and signed the final documents. The transaction took less than 10 minutes. $1,000. Ownership transferred. Just like that. Richard shook his head as he walked away. Some people collect classic cars. He smirked. Others collect bad decisions. Caleb did not respond. He waited until the parking lot emptied and the company vehicles disappeared down the road. Then he walked toward the garage alone. The old building seemed even larger up close. Dust covered everything. The air smelled of oil, wood, and forgotten years. He pushed open a side door and stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof. Shadows stretched across abandoned workbenches and rusted tools. For several minutes, he simply looked around. Then something caught his attention. At the very back of the building, hidden behind shelves and decades of debris, stood a narrow steel door. Unlike everything else in the garage, it was locked. For several seconds, Caleb Walker stood motionless in the dim light of the abandoned garage. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that slipped through holes in the aging roof. The locked steel door remained hidden behind shelves covered with decades of forgotten tools, broken equipment, and boxes no one had touched in years. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have assumed it led to a storage closet or an empty room. Caleb was not most people. He slowly cleared away the debris blocking the entrance. Rusted wrenches clattered onto the floor. Old wooden crates crumbled beneath his hands. The air smelled of oil, sawdust, and time itself. After nearly 20 minutes of work, the door finally stood exposed. A faded brass plaque remained attached near the handle. Caleb brushed away the dust. The engraved letters were barely visible. He squinted. Then his eyes widened slightly. The name engraved on the metal was Arthur Mercer. Even after all these years, the name still carried weight in the automotive world. Arthur Mercer had been considered one of the most gifted restoration engineers of his generation. Collectors still spoke about his work. Museums displayed vehicles he had restored. Yet according to public records, Mercer had disappeared from the industry more than 30 years earlier. Caleb stared at the plaque. Something suddenly felt different about the garage. He examined the lock. It was old but intact. After several attempts, he finally managed to force the mechanism loose. The metal clicked softly. Then the door opened. A cool rush of stale air drifted from the darkness beyond. Caleb stepped inside. His flashlight revealed a room far larger than he expected. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Workbenches stood neatly arranged. Unlike the rest of the building, this room had been carefully preserved. Dust covered everything, but nothing appeared damaged. It looked less like a storage area and more like a workshop frozen in time. Caleb moved deeper into the room. His flashlight passed across stacks of notebooks. Engineering diagrams, blueprints, technical sketches, detailed restoration records. Hundreds of pages, maybe thousands. His heartbeat quickened. He picked up one notebook and opened it carefully. Every page contained handwritten observations, measurements, and techniques developed over decades. This was not junk. This was knowledge. Valuable knowledge. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the Wyoming landscape as the sun slowly disappeared behind distant mountains. Caleb remained inside the hidden workshop for hours. The more he examined the material, the more unbelievable it became. Arthur Mercer had documented everything. Every restoration. Every experiment. Every custom modification. Some of the techniques had never been published. Others appeared decades ahead of their time. By midnight, Caleb sat quietly at the workbench holding a faded blueprint. The silence around him felt almost sacred. Somewhere nearby, an old clock still ticked faintly against the wall. He smiled for the first time all day. Meanwhile, nearly 200 miles away in Denver, Madeline Carter reviewed property reports inside her office. Richard Hale entered carrying a folder. "The demolition permit is already being processed," he said. "Good," Madeline replied without looking up. Richard smirked. "That mechanic will learn soon enough." Madeline paused. For some reason, she remembered the calm expression on Caleb's face when everyone else had been laughing. She remembered how certain he seemed. "Maybe," she said quietly. Richard laughed. "Trust me, in a few weeks, he will wish he had kept his money." But at that exact moment, Caleb was turning another page inside Arthur Mercer's hidden workshop. And with every page he read, the value of that $1,000 garage was becoming harder to measure. The next morning, Caleb Walker arrived before sunrise. The Wyoming sky was still painted in deep shades of blue when he unlocked the garage and stepped inside. The building creaked softly in the cold morning air. Dust covered every surface. The roof still leaked in several places. The electrical system barely functioned. Yet somehow, everything looked different now. Most people saw a failing property. Caleb saw potential. He placed a notebook from Arthur Mercer's hidden workshop on the main workbench and rolled up his sleeves. Then he got to work. The first week was brutal. He repaired sections of the roof himself. He replaced broken wiring. He hauled away truckloads of rusted debris. By sunset each day, his muscles ached and his hands were covered with cuts and dirt. Yet every evening, before going home, he spent several hours studying Mercer's journals. The old engineer's notes felt less like instructions and more like conversations across time. Every page revealed new techniques. Every diagram offered solutions Caleb had never considered before. Meanwhile, people in town continued laughing. At the local diner, conversations often drifted toward the old garage. "Give him a month," one man said. "2 months at most," another replied. "That building should have been demolished years ago." Caleb heard the comments occasionally. He never responded. He simply kept working. By the end of the second month, small changes began appearing. The broken sign disappeared. Fresh paint covered the exterior walls. New lighting illuminated the service bays. The weeds were gone. The cracked parking lot had been cleaned. People driving past started slowing down. Curiosity slowly replaced mockery. One afternoon, a retired rancher stopped by with a classic pickup truck that had not run in nearly 10 years. "You think you can bring it back?" he asked. Caleb smiled. "Let us find out." 3 days later, the truck rolled out of the garage running smoother than it had in decades. The rancher told his friends. Those friends told others. Before long, more vehicles began arriving. Some came from neighboring towns. Others traveled from across the state. Caleb remained focused. He repaired engines during the day and studied Mercer's notes at night. Week after week, the garage slowly transformed. Hundreds of miles away, Madeline Carter sat in a conference room reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant entered. "There is something you might want to see." Madeline looked up. The assistant handed her a tablet displaying several photographs posted online. The images showed the old garage, except it barely looked like the same place anymore. The exterior had been restored. The service bays were busy. Several beautifully repaired vehicles sat outside waiting for pickup. Madeline stared at the screen. When were these taken? Yesterday. Richard Hale glanced over from the opposite side of the table and laughed. A fresh coat of paint does not change reality. Madeline continued studying the images. Something about them bothered her. Not because the garage looked successful, because Caleb had somehow accomplished all of it so quickly. How many customers does he have? She asked. The assistant checked another report. More every week. Richard shook his head dismissively. It will not last. But that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains, a line of vehicles stretched outside Caleb's garage waiting for service. The lights inside glowed warmly against the darkening sky. And for the first time, people stopped calling it a mistake. They started calling it something else. A comeback. By the beginning of the 4th month, something unexpected started happening. Customers were no longer visiting Caleb Walker's garage simply because they needed repairs. They were coming because they had heard stories. Stories about engines nobody else could fix. Stories about classic vehicles that seemed beyond saving. Stories about a mechanic who treated every customer with patience and respect, whether they arrived in a luxury collector car or a 20-year-old pickup truck. The garage parking lot filled earlier each week. Some mornings, vehicles were already waiting before sunrise. Caleb never changed his routine. He unlocked the doors. He swept the floor. He brewed coffee. Then he got to work. Success had not changed him. One windy afternoon, a transport trailer pulled into the lot carrying a faded 1967 Mustang Fastback. The owner stepped out looking frustrated. 3 restoration shops turned me away, he said. Nobody can figure out the problem. Caleb studied the vehicle quietly. The paint was worn. The engine had been modified multiple times over the decades. Most mechanics would have seen complications. Caleb saw possibilities. Leave it with me for a few days, he said. 4 days later, the Mustang rolled out of the garage running better than it had in years. The owner recorded a video before driving away. He posted it online that evening. Within 48 hours, thousands of people had watched it. Then tens of thousands. Comments appeared from every corner of the country. Collectors, mechanics, restoration enthusiasts. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who was Caleb Walker? Meanwhile, inside Carter Holdings headquarters, Madeline Carter sat at her desk scrolling through the growing online attention. Video after video appeared on her screen. Beautiful restorations. Customer testimonials. Photographs of vehicles lined up outside the garage. She leaned back in her chair. This cannot be the same place. Her assistant smiled. It is. Across the room, Richard Hale shook his head dismissively. Internet attention means nothing. Madeline looked up. Does it? Richard crossed his arms. People get excited about trends every day. This has been growing for months. Richard said nothing. The silence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Back in Wyoming, Caleb continued exploring Arthur Mercer's notebooks during quiet evenings after the garage closed. One particular journal caught his attention. Unlike the others, it contained sketches for restoration methods that Mercer never completed. There were handwritten notes in the margins. Questions, theories, experiments left unfinished. Caleb became fascinated. Night after night, he studied the material. Slowly, he began adapting some of the concepts for modern restoration work. The results were remarkable. Vehicles that once seemed impossible to restore started returning to life. Word spread even faster. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, a black luxury SUV pulled into the parking lot. Employees inside the garage stopped working for a moment. The vehicle looked out of place among the trucks and classic cars. The driver's door opened. Madeline Carter stepped out. She looked around slowly. Fresh paint. Busy service bays. Customers waiting outside. Engines humming. Mechanics working. For several seconds, she simply stood there. This was not the abandoned property she remembered. It was alive. Caleb noticed her near the entrance and walked over. Neither spoke immediately. The wind moved gently through the parking lot, while distant mountains glowed beneath the fading light. Finally, Madeline smiled slightly. I think I underestimated you. Caleb smiled back. A lot of people did. For the first time since selling the garage, Madeline found herself wondering whether the most valuable thing on that property had never been the building at all. 6 months after purchasing the abandoned garage, Caleb Walker no longer recognized the property that everyone once mocked. The transformation was impossible to ignore. What had started as a neglected building surrounded by weeds and broken concrete had become one of the most respected restoration centers in the region. The parking lot was full nearly every day. Customers traveled from neighboring states. Some arrived from hundreds of miles away after hearing stories online. Others came because someone they trusted insisted there was only one person who could help them. Caleb never advertised. He never chased attention. His reputation grew because of the quality of his work and the way he treated people. One crisp Wyoming morning, the garage opened before sunrise as usual. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the workshop. Mechanics moved between restoration projects. Engines hummed. Tools clicked softly against steel. The atmosphere felt alive. Caleb walked through the facility, greeting employees by name. Just months earlier, he had worked alone. Now more than a dozen people earned a living there. Some had struggled to find work before joining the garage. Others had relocated because they believed in what Caleb was building. The growth was creating something bigger than a business. It was creating opportunity. Later that afternoon, Madeline Carter returned for a second visit. This time she came alone. No executives. No assistants. No meetings. She wanted to see the place for herself. As she stepped from her vehicle, she immediately noticed the difference. Customers filled the waiting area. Classic cars occupied every service bay. Several restored vehicles sat outside, gleaming beneath the Wyoming sun. The entire property felt vibrant, purposeful, successful. Caleb spotted her near the entrance and walked over. "Good to see you again," he said. Madeline smiled. "I am beginning to think this is not the same garage I sold." Caleb laughed quietly. Sometimes things become what people expect. Sometimes they become what people never imagined. Together they walked through the facility. Employees greeted Caleb warmly. Customers thanked him. One elderly collector proudly showed Madeline a restored vehicle that Caleb's team had completed. "Nobody else would even attempt this project," he said. "He brought it back to life." Madeline listened carefully. Everywhere she turned, she heard similar stories. Respect, gratitude, admiration. The reactions felt genuine. Not purchased, not manufactured, earned. Later, while reviewing company reports back in Denver, Richard Hale received an update he did not like. Property values surrounding Caleb's garage had increased dramatically. New businesses were opening nearby. Tourism related to automotive restoration events had begun attracting visitors. The entire area was changing. Richard stared at the numbers. This cannot be happening. But the data continued telling the same story. The property he once called worthless was becoming increasingly valuable. More importantly, the influence surrounding it continued expanding. That evening, Madeline stood beside a window overlooking the Denver skyline. Her thoughts returned to the garage, to Caleb, to the quiet determination she had witnessed. Most people who suddenly found success became louder. Caleb had become even more grounded. Her phone buzzed with another report. The estimated value of the garage property had increased several times over since the sale. Madeline lowered the report slowly. Somewhere in Wyoming, a man everyone laughed at 6 months earlier had accomplished what experts believed impossible. And for the first time, she began to wonder whether the greatest asset on that property had never been Arthur Mercer's hidden workshop. It had been Caleb Walker himself. Success often attracts admiration. It also attracts attention from people who wish they had seen the opportunity first. By the beginning of the 7th month, Caleb Walker's garage had become impossible to ignore. Automotive magazines were publishing articles about the remarkable restoration center in Wyoming. Collectors were scheduling appointments months in advance. Businesses nearby were thriving from the increased traffic. What started as a forgotten property had become the center of a growing local economy. Yet while most people celebrated the transformation, Richard Hale saw something else. He saw numbers. Valuable numbers. One rainy afternoon, he sat in his office studying reports spread across his desk. Property assessments, development forecasts, commercial investment projections. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. The area surrounding Caleb's garage was becoming one of the most promising commercial zones in the region. Richard leaned back in his chair. "We sold it for $1,000, he muttered. The sentence felt almost painful to say aloud. Across town, investors had already started purchasing nearby parcels of land. Restaurants were opening. Service businesses were expanding. Tourism related to restoration events continued growing. The entire district was changing, and at the center of it all stood Caleb's garage. Richard immediately scheduled meetings with several development groups. Within days, representatives began approaching neighboring property owners with purchase offers. Rumors spread quickly through Riverton. People started talking about large commercial projects, shopping centers, office complexes, luxury developments. The attention made some residents excited, others worried. Meanwhile, Caleb remained focused on his work. One morning, a longtime customer mentioned the rumors while picking up a restored vehicle. "You hear what is happening?" the man asked. Caleb looked up from his workbench. "Not really. Developers are buying everything around here." Caleb smiled faintly. "People can buy what they want." The customer hesitated. "What if they come after this place?" Caleb glanced around the garage. Employees worked on restoration projects. Customers chatted in the waiting area. Engines hummed softly beneath bright lights. "Then we will deal with it when the time comes." His calm response surprised everyone. But that was how Caleb approached most challenges, one problem at a time. Several days later, Madeline Carter received a concerning report from her legal department. Multiple investment groups had recently contacted Carter Holdings requesting historical records related to the garage sale. The timing felt strange. She reviewed the documents personally. The more she read, the more uneasy she became. Something was happening behind the scenes. That evening, she called Richard directly. "Why are outside investors suddenly requesting records from a transaction completed months ago?" Richard sounded almost too casual. "Probably routine due diligence." Madeline remained silent. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was avoiding a direct answer. "Richard." Another pause followed. "The property has become more valuable than anyone expected." "Including you?" she asked quietly. Richard did not answer. The silence told her everything she needed to know. Later that night, Madeline sat alone in her office overlooking the Denver skyline. Rain streaked against the glass while city lights shimmered below. Something felt wrong. Not illegal, not obvious, but wrong. Her instincts rarely failed her in business. And those instincts were now telling her that someone was trying to rewrite a story that had already been written. Hundreds of miles away, Caleb locked the garage for the evening and stepped outside. The Wyoming air felt cool and peaceful. The parking lot was empty. The lights glowed warmly through the windows behind him. For a brief moment, everything seemed calm. He had no idea that powerful people were already discussing the future of the land beneath his feet. The following week, the pressure surrounding the garage began to grow. Letters arrived from development firms. Real estate representatives stopped by unexpectedly. Investment groups requested meetings. Most offered large amounts of money for nearby properties. A few quietly asked whether Caleb Walker would consider selling. Every time, his answer remained the same. No, the response was polite, firm, unchanging. People eventually stopped trying to persuade him directly. But behind the scenes, conversations continued. One afternoon, Madeline Carter arrived in Riverton without announcing her visit. She found Caleb exactly where she expected him to be. He stood beside a classic Chevrolet restoration project, reviewing measurements with one of his mechanics. The garage remained busy. Customers moved through the waiting area. Engines hummed in the background. The place felt less like a business and more like a community. Caleb noticed her near the entrance. "You look concerned," he said. Madeline smiled faintly. "Do I?" "A little." They walked toward a quieter corner of the workshop. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Madeline handed him a folder. Caleb opened it. Inside were property reports, investment summaries, and development projections. He slowly turned the pages. "This is about the land." "Partly. And the other part?" Madeline looked directly at him. "Richard." The answer surprised him. She explained everything she had discovered. The investors, the sudden interest, the unusual requests for old transaction records, the growing effort to revisit decisions that had already been finalized months earlier. Caleb listened carefully. When she finished, he simply closed the folder. "Thank you." Madeline blinked. "That is all you have to say?" Caleb smiled. "You came all the way here to warn me. You are not worried?" He glanced across the garage floor. Employees worked on restoration projects. Customers chatted comfortably. Sunlight streamed through newly restored windows. Worry changes very little. Madeline could not help laughing softly. "You are different from anyone I have ever met." Before Caleb could answer, one of the mechanics approached. "Boss, you should see this." They followed him into Arthur Mercer's hidden workshop. Over the months, the room had been carefully organized and preserved. Shelves lined the walls. Blueprints rested inside protective cases. Historical documents filled cabinets. The mechanic pointed toward a newly cataloged collection. We finally finished sorting everything. Caleb stepped forward and opened one of the folders. His expression changed immediately. Inside were original property documents connected to the garage. Not just engineering records, ownership records, survey reports, historical correspondence. Madeline moved closer. What is it? Caleb carefully reviewed several pages. The room became silent except for the sound of turning paper. Then he found something unexpected. A letter written by Arthur Mercer decades earlier. Attached to it were development assessments and land evaluations. Caleb read slowly. Madeline watched his face. What does it say? He looked up. Arthur knew this area would eventually become valuable. How? He documented everything. More papers followed. More reports. More evidence. The forgotten engineer had spent years researching future transportation routes, commercial growth patterns, and regional expansion. He believed the land surrounding the garage would become strategically important one day. Madeline stared at the documents. Suddenly, many things made sense. Richard had always claimed the property was worthless. Yet these reports suggested otherwise. She felt a chill run through her thoughts. If these documents were genuine, then someone inside Carter Holdings may have ignored far more information than anyone realized. And for the first time, Madeline understood that the story surrounding Caleb's garage was about to become much bigger than real estate. 3 days later, the executive boardroom at Carter Holdings was unusually quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Denver skyline, while senior executives gathered around a polished conference table. Financial reports, legal documents, and development projections rested in front of every seat. Yet none of those papers held the room's attention. The focus remained on a collection of documents recently discovered inside Arthur Mercer's hidden workshop. Madeline Carter sat at the head of the table. Her expression was calm, but everyone present could sense the seriousness beneath it. Across the room, Richard Hale adjusted his tie and reviewed notes on a tablet. He appeared confident, perhaps too confident. Caleb Walker sat quietly near the far end of the table. His work jacket looked out of place among expensive suits and executive titles. Yet unlike many people in the room, he seemed completely comfortable. He was not there to argue. He was there because Madeline had personally invited him. The meeting began. Legal teams reviewed transaction records. Financial officers summarized development projections. Consultants presented land valuation studies. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The property surrounding the garage had become significantly more valuable than anyone predicted. Richard listened patiently. Then he stood. With respect, he said, we are discussing hindsight. Nobody could have known this outcome 6 months ago. Several executives nodded. The argument sounded reasonable. For a moment. Then Madeline slid a folder across the table. Actually, she said quietly, someone did know. The room grew still. Richard's expression tightened. Madeline opened the folder. Inside were Arthur Mercer's original reports. Transportation forecasts. Regional development studies. Commercial growth analyses. Decades old. Remarkably accurate. She continued. These documents were created years before the sale. Silence. A projector illuminated the wall behind her. Charts appeared. Maps followed. Then historical records. The evidence was overwhelming. Mercer had documented the area's future potential in extraordinary detail. Several executives leaned forward in disbelief. Richard remained motionless. Madeline turned another page. There is more. Additional records appeared on the screen. Internal reviews. Property assessments. Archive correspondence. Documents that had passed through company channels years earlier. The room became even quieter. An executive near the window removed his glasses. Another slowly shook his head. Piece by piece, a larger picture emerged. Important information had not been completely hidden. It had simply been dismissed, ignored, treated as insignificant. Madeline looked directly at Richard. You reviewed several of these assessments yourself. No response came. Do you deny it? She asked. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Across the room, nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Even the city noise beyond the windows seemed distant. Caleb remained seated, calm as always. He never looked triumphant, never looked angry. He simply listened. The room slowly realized something important. The mechanic sitting quietly near the end of the table had never manipulated numbers, never pressured anyone, never demanded recognition. He simply saw value where others refused to look. The projector displayed one final image, a photograph of the garage on the day it was sold. Rusted, neglected, forgotten. Then a second image appeared beside it. The same property 6 months later. Restored, thriving, creating jobs, supporting families, inspiring an entire community. No one laughed this time. No one made jokes about junk. No one questioned the decision Caleb had made. The boardroom remained completely silent. It was the kind of silence that only arrives when certainty collapses and truth takes its place. And in that moment, every person in the room understood exactly who had been right from the beginning. 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting, life in Riverton felt different. Not because Caleb Walker had changed. He had not. He still arrived before sunrise. He still unlocked the garage himself. He still spent his mornings greeting customers and his afternoons working alongside his team. The difference was in how people looked at him. The laughter was gone. The doubt was gone. What remained was respect. The garage continued expanding, but carefully. Caleb refused to rush growth. Every new project had a purpose. Every new hire mattered. Every improvement served the people who depended on the business. The old building that once stood abandoned had become the heart of a thriving automotive campus. Restoration bays filled one side of the property. Training workshops occupied another. Apprentices learned skills from experienced mechanics. Small businesses nearby benefited from the steady flow of visitors. What Caleb had built was larger than a company. It was a community. One cool autumn morning, Madeline Carter drove into Riverton once again. The mountains glowed beneath clear skies. Golden leaves drifted across quiet streets. As she approached the property, she slowed her vehicle. The transformation still amazed her. Months earlier, she had sold a neglected garage for $1,000. Now she was looking at something entirely different. Customers filled the parking areas. Beautifully restored vehicles lined the grounds. New buildings stood where empty lots once existed. Yet despite all the success, the place somehow remained humble. Authentic. Human. Madeline found Caleb near the original garage building reviewing plans with several employees. He looked exactly the same as he had on the day they first met. Same work jacket. Same calm expression. Same quiet confidence. When he noticed her approaching, he smiled. "Good morning." "Good morning," she replied. For a few moments, they walked through the property together. Employees waved. Customers stopped to say hello. The atmosphere felt warm and genuine. Eventually, they reached the old workshop where Arthur Mercer's hidden room remained preserved as a piece of history. Sunlight filtered through the windows as they stood inside. Madeline looked around slowly. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not bought this place?" Caleb considered the question. "Sometimes." "And?" He smiled faintly. "Then I get back to work." Madeline laughed softly. The answer felt perfectly consistent with the man she had come to know. She looked around once more. The notebooks. The blueprints. The preserved history. Then she looked through the window toward the busy campus beyond. "You turned this into something extraordinary." Caleb shook his head. "No." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "No. Arthur Mercer left knowledge behind. Good people helped build this place. Customers trusted us. Employees believed in the vision." He glanced toward the activity outside. "I just gave it a chance." Silence settled gently between them. Not an awkward silence. The kind that arrives when words are no longer necessary. Madeline thought back to the day of the sale. The laughter. The jokes. The certainty that the property was worthless. How easy it had been for everyone to see only rust, broken windows, and peeling paint. Caleb had seen something else. Potential. Possibility. Value hidden beneath neglect. Finally, she asked the question that had been on her mind for months. "How did you know?" Caleb looked out across the property one last time. Mechanics worked. Customers smiled. Engines came back to life. A forgotten corner of town had found new purpose. Then he answered quietly. "Because I learned a long time ago that the world is full of people who see what something is." He paused. "Very few take the time to see what it can become." Madeline said nothing. She simply stood there, watching the life that now filled the place everyone once called junk. And in the peaceful silence that followed, the truth felt impossible to miss. Real value is rarely found by those looking for shortcuts. It is built with patience, faith, and honest work, one day at a time.